Rome wasn't built in a day. A lesson from history. What's missing in modern discipleship? A true story I heard years ago goes like this. A Muslim and a Christian were debating the relative merits of their faiths. The Muslim called out from the crowd, "Islam is true because it is newer." "What do you mean?" asked the Christian. The Muslim replied, "Islam must be true because it is newer and younger." "Why?" said the Christian. The Muslim responded, "If you were buying a car, which one would you choose, a new one or old one?" His friends murmured their approval at this wise response. The Christian replied, "New or old car? I would choose the one that works." Now that's a cute preacher's story about scoring points in a debate. However, what if you are trying to follow Jesus, but you feel like it hasn't made you or the people around you much of a better person? It hasn't, quote, worked. Gradually, that sense of failure maybe has seeped into your psyche at a subconscious level. You have what philosophers call cognitive dissonance, the discomfort you feel when your beliefs don't quite add up. Maybe you blame yourself or others or God, but you feel like there is something missing. I want to suggest maybe there is. Now, what I want to share isn't an instant fix or some magical formula that only I have found, but I think that you may not have heard things framed in this way and in the ways that I'm about to share. If you become disenchanted with church because you didn't see much grace there, or even didn't see much grace in yourself, neither you nor the church is probably to blame. Both you and they are probably operating on a model of church that is at least partially disconnected from one that works. I want to suggest 3 elements from church history and scripture that might provide better ways to become more like Jesus, more like a community of Jesus, and one that is therefore more likely to be a light to the world. This is Dchurched.com. I'm Jools. Welcome. Before suggesting some solutions, let's first talk about the problem. All too often in the modern Western church, we have inherited a model of church that is shaped more by culture than good historical church practice or scripture. What do I mean? Well, firstly, we're passive. We sit in rows and absorb the Sunday service. Most of the action is up the front and has been for about 1600 years. In short, our model of church is often not particularly participative and corporate. This is especially true of free churches and the non-liturgical churches. Sometimes when there is participation in, for example, singing, most of that comes from the front and the congregation is a watcher rather than a participant, while the main action takes place up the front. And with that passivity also comes this, a consumerist mentality. We weigh the merit of the spiritual product we're being served. We are consumers. Does it give us a sense of immediate gratification? I mean, after all, being boring is a key performance indicator on our measuring stick. Feeling blessed or excited or challenged is a positive performance review. Now, don't get me wrong, I also have a low boredom threshold. But here's the thing, I go to the gym every other day because sometimes in life there is a higher value than whether I am bored or not. I don't enjoy the gym particularly. It doesn't give me that high that some people seem to get from it. But I do see the difference it makes. And so also with spiritual practice, we have to work out whether what I'm doing and what we're doing is worth sometimes being a bit bored about, because its long-term effects are life-changing. Or shifting that question slightly, what is it that we do corporately that might best transform us as a community? Take Sunday worship, for example. We rarely ask how effective it is as a means of transforming disciples. And with that comes a question. Are there practices from history or scripture that are likely to embed long-term changes in our spiritual DNA? Before we think about that, there is one more comment I want to make about culture. It's passive, it's consumerist, and also it's individualistic and privatized. We think spiritual change is primarily about me and God getting it together. Despite the fact that most of the New Testament is addressed to the plural, to the group, we want spirituality to be about Jesus and me. And so we sometimes want discipleship and growth disconnected from deep and accountable relationships or from actions of love in the wider world. We don't want to submit to one another and surrender to community for a whole host of reasons, and some of them are good, but some of them are bad because we're being individualistic and privatized. And we find it challenging to live our discipleship in the everyday world. We'd rather keep our spirituality a Sunday or leisure time activity. And the result of all this is that our shared church life is often ineffective. Ineffective to bring about character change. It just doesn't work to make us more loving than we were a year ago. No matter how many blessed meetings or messages we've been to, no matter how many energized worship times we have had. Even if we know the liturgy from Sunday services backwards, it feels like we are still not very like Jesus. We could talk about a whole host of other cultural factors that work in the church and that work against effective discipleship. That will do for now. Passivity, consumerism, individualism, all of which is ultimately ineffective at creating deep-rooted change. That's quite a list, isn't it? And I don't mean to be overly negative, because all of these things affect me too. And I recognize there are many church communities of all denominations which buck the trend fantastically well. But the influence of these trends is always lurking. The net result is that many are disenchanted at who we are as a community and who I am as an individual believer, and wondering at the difference we're making in the world. We're nice people, but not alive and kicking with the grace of Christ, a grace that we then also carry into our secular lives. Of course, we know that God's grace is always bigger and frequently able to work in and through any situation, community, or flawed person. But if this negative list has been your experience, you're not alone. I want to suggest 3 factors that are often missing, and these come from the voices of the church up to about 350 AD. We do well to hear these voices from before the days of Christendom. They have unique things to say, and these 3 things are a bit like a recipe for baking. Each of these ingredients are vital. With one missing, the whole doesn't work. Here's what they are. They are patient, community-shaped habits of grace. Patient, community-shaped habits of grace. Firstly, patience. Patience is not often viewed as a central trait of discipleship. We might somewhat ironically pray the prayer, Lord, give me patience, give it to me now. But it's not generally at the heart of what we think of when it comes to following Jesus. There's a few reasons for that. It doesn't sound sexy or radical. It sounds rather dull. You wouldn't want "he was very patient" to be put on your gravestone. We don't understand patience, I think, the way the early church did. If we did, it might change some of our perspectives. But their commitment to patience as a key virtue changed the Roman Empire. We're also in a culture that works against patience. We're in a fast-paced culture. Information is instant. Travel is less time-consuming than it once was. I sit there with my phone while watching the television, while half listening to my wife say something. Our weeks are filled with busyness. We expect instant food and a fast track to achieving our goals. As the old song goes, I want it all and I want it now. But the reality is that God's wisdom does not come with a click of a button. Information does. Sometimes good ideas do, but not necessarily wisdom. That takes a slowing down and the allowance of time and a stillness and patience as we listen to God. This aversion to patience was not always so. In 204 AD, church leader Tertullian penned a whole treatise on patience. This reflected a wider value held across the church. We have records of other church leaders also talking at great length about this central virtue of patience. It was not widely accepted in the Roman Empire as an important value. In fact, it was despised. But Tertullian argues that God was lavishly generous to all people, both the good and the bad, and that God does not compel belief, but, quote, by his patience, he hopes to draw humans to himself. Church historian Alan Kreider argues that patience was at the heart of the mission of the church, which sounds a little bit strange to our modern ears. But the idea of living a life of patiently waiting for God was supposed to spark intrigue in the hearts of outsiders. Not always being busy getting ahead, not restless, trusting when life deals out lemons, being patient with nasty neighbors, and so on. Patience was that sense of relaxing into God's good timing and not needing to force things. That sense of trust that he has things sorted and we don't need to be striving to make things happen or anxious when things go wrong. God's got it sorted. In fact, Kreider argues that it was this virtue that changed when the church was taken over by the empire in the 4th century. Suddenly people like Augustine, a church leader of the time, wrote somewhat negatively about patience, seeing it as sometimes as bad if it meant you weren't placing your hands on the tiller and moving things along towards mission or justice and so on. And yet if we look at the first 3 centuries of the church with its emphasis on patience, it was a time of unprecedented growth. There was no grand strategy or management for growth, just a commitment to make patient disciples and communities of patient disciples. We'll talk more next time about what that looks like and how that happens. This is Dchurched.com. My name's Jools. Don't forget to like this podcast, and if you feel able, sponsor us via our GoFundMe page and join us on our Facebook community page. Thanks for listening.